Chesa Boudin was ousted as San Francisco's district attorney on Tuesday in a recall effort that argued his reforms to the city were too lenient and made the city less safe. According to the latest figures from city elections officials, around 60% of San Franciscans who cast ballots voted to recall him.
This comes as progressives see multiple losses in several key races, including Los Angeles mayoral race, where tough-on-crime Rick Caruso, a Republican turned Democrat, will face Representative Karen Bass in a runoff election. And in Texas, Representative Henry Cuellar, who is considered the most conservative Democrat in the House, he has defeated activist and attorney Jessica Cisneros by fewer than 300 votes in Texas's 28th congressional district runoff.
Here to discuss with us is public defender and commentator Olayemi Olurin and civil rights and defense attorney Michael Bloch. Welcome to you both.
Good morning, y'all.
Okay, so the question that a lot of people have is this election result with Chesa, the progressive DA that people really heralded when he was elected a few years ago, has San Francisco markedly turned to the right since he was elected, or is this representative of something else, potentially the millions of dollars of dark money that have funded the recall effort? What do you make of this, Michael?
Well, I think certainly the marketing effort and the dollars played a big part. I also think it's a product of this perception fueled by well-funded police unions and the media that not only that crime is rising in San Francisco, but that crime is rising because of the progressive policies of Chesa Boudin, which I think is demonstrably not true. I think data shows, sort of study after study shows that the progressive policies of a certain prosecutor don't actually impact the crime rate. But I think that message and the narrative that's been fueled in very vivid terms by the media has had a huge impact.
Well, okay, I think that's probably an unsatisfying message, though. If I'm a prosecutor, crime is up in San Francisco. Homicides have increased, burglaries have increased. And you say, well, what can the prosecutor do about it? If you're the prosecutor, you're going to get voted out. If you say, yeah, crime's up, but that's not really my problem, what can I do about it? Go ahead, Olayemi.
Oh, I said marginally. We're looking at the percentages, but if you actually look at the numbers, crime had a very, very marginal increase. Homicides went up from like 11 to 15, things like that, right? If you actually look at the raw data. But I think a situation like this is only shocking if you feed into the idea that our issues with getting criminal justice reform is a Democrat versus Republican thing. And I've said before, and I've written tons of things on it, that it's not, right? The media is highly complicit in fueling propaganda and how we perceive these, crime strikes. If you look at a place like New York City, which is also some place that's touted as this progressive utopia, when we had historic bail reform and we saw it, positively change the rates at Rikers and change how the criminal system was impacted, the first thing you saw was an immediate propaganda campaign from the Post and all of the media to, manufacture this crime wave in order to roll back bail reform, which is what they did. So if you look at places, it never just stops at, the progressive initiative. We get that you get a progressive prosecutor, you get a progressive set of laws, and then you immediately have to spend time fighting and combating the media that pushes propaganda. And if you see a situation like Boudin, not only did he have to fight the media wave, but he also had to fight a pack where they were actually, doning to try to get him out. And it's not as surprising when people are like, oh, these are well-funded, these are Democrats and rich Democrats and people doing it too, not just Republicans. Although there is a Republican donor that gave like $900,000 of the $1.8 million, the PAC that funded this recall movement. So it is relevant, but I think you have to look at the fact that there's an invested interest. It's not just a matter of, Democrats or Republicans being on two different allegiances. Like rich Democrats and rich Republicans are not that there's not this major divergence between what are their interests when it comes to propaganda and policing. So it's not that striking, but I think it's just a reflection of people have to remember that it's a maintained effort. You don't just get the progressive prosecutor in, you don't just get the progressive laws. You have to spend time fighting the media who's going to push propaganda at every chance they get. And people are going to consume that because people, rightfully so, you can't really blame the people that they rely on the media to give them unbiased reporting. If you give them data, they look at numbers, percentage increase, and you're telling them there's a crime wave, they believe you, whereas regardless of whether or not that's actually what's happening on the ground or whether Boudin is doing anything different than what he promised to do or what we consider effective. So
Yeah, well, can you talk about that a little bit, Michael? You know, there was this push a few years ago to have progressive prosecutors. There seemed to be an understanding that the kind of tough on crime activities of the 90s hadn't yielded results. Kamala Harris herself painted herself, rightly or wrongly, fairly or unfairly, as a progressive prosecutor to rise to the top of the Democratic Party. And you know, a former colleague of mine at The Intercept, Lee Fong, actually wrote about how she had a kind of tough on crime approach to herself to be DA of San Francisco back in the day, defeating a genuinely progressive prosecutor with imagery on her flyers of chalk outlines on the ground and bare-chested men with gang signs and all of this kind of thing. What is this flip that's going on, and why do people seem to not understand what the relationship between prosecutors and crime really is? Why do we want progressive prosecutors in the first place, and you know, what do we hope to gain from them? How much control do they really have over crime rates and the like?
Right. Well, I think what changed is we had a global pandemic, and crime rates, a number of violent crimes in cities across America went up for reasons likely having nothing to do with progressive prosecutors, which is why it went up across the country, including in districts where you have prosecutors that are quote unquote tough on crime. And so if you think about it, Chesa Boudin took office in January 2020, and then the pandemic hit, and then homelessness exploded, and anxiety exploded, and mental health issues rose. And all of a sudden we had rising crime rates, some rising crime rates in certain cities, in certain areas. And at that point, we had a sort of knee-jerk reaction to, like Olayemi says, fueled by propaganda and fueled by the media, to pin that rising crime rate on progressive prosecutors, and Chesa Boudin became sort of the poster boy for that. I think to the other part of your question, the reason why prosecutors like Chesa Boudin took office in the first place is because there was a well-justified reaction to the idea that we were incarcerating way too many people, and particularly people of color. And so people like Chesa Boudin and other progressive prosecutors across the country had an opening to take office to deal with something that people really wanted to deal with and should have wanted to deal with, because mass incarceration was and is a gigantic problem. So go ahead.
So some people are going to say, you know, you're incarcerating too many people, and they're going to hear that and say, well, if people do crimes, you got to punish them. Oftentimes that means jail. What does this mean? You're just letting people out on the street. Well, of course, that's going to cause people to commit more crimes. How do you respond to folks who are thinking that right now?
Oh, me?
Oh, sure, Ole.
Well, here's the thing, right? Chesa Boudin was actually very focused on violent crime, and there's no indication that that wasn't his primary focus. If you look at what I think has been the largest complaint about him, and he's seen in San Francisco, and based on his allegations have been that the major donor for his PAC had asked him to, you know, sign an initiative basically to push the homeless people out of visibility, and that seemed to be the largest complaint. People are that they're seeing more homelessness, and if you look at what the DA's role in that, a prosecutor is there to prosecute, right? They're there to prosecute people, or if they, in the case of a progressive DA, you work out of their way to prevent as much prosecution where they don't think it's going to be effective. In a case like homelessness, right? They're not waging war on homelessness. They're waging war on homeless people. The initiatives are that they don't want to see homeless people so much. So what is a prosecutor's role actually in that in terms of solving homelessness? The only thing they can do is or incarcerate them or prosecute them. That seems to be the angle that we're looking for. There's no other actual initiative the district attorney has there. And if you look at a place like New York City, where we have the same thing, we have a very pro-carceral mayor that's waging war on the homeless. They're not actually engaging in initiatives. It's not really about crime. The narrative isn't about crime here or the homeless people causing crime. It's about their visibility. So it really just speaks to, it's not an effective means of addressing crime. It's not that he's not addressing crime. It's that he's not using the criminal system to hide away these social ills and things that people don't want to be confronted with the visibility of.
You know, going back to a point you made, putting it all on the pandemic, though, I think is frustrating because some of the the way the pandemic was handled, the policies, the shuttering of social services, the all of that kind of thing. I mean, those were, I guess they're not progressive prosecutors behind them, but those were choices made by policymakers, many of them Democratic in large cities, that I think have absolutely contributed to the fraying of our society and thus rising crime. But those were policies too. And look, in D.C. where I live, the homelessness has gotten, or the visibility of the homeless has certainly gotten worse. There are more tent cities now than at any point in which I've lived here previously. Not all cities are the same. Some cities the crime problem is not as bad as it's presented. In other cities it is quite worse. I was just looking at Philadelphia's homicide numbers are as high as they were in the 90s, a period of the Philadelphia period. So look, I get if maybe it's not specific people's fault or that their policies are being wrongly blamed, but the reality that some things are getting worse in a lot of cities, and that progressive solutions, even solutions I would like to see. I'm no fan of over-incarceration. I think a lot of people are in prison too long and could be released with minimal problem for society, but it doesn't get around the fact that people are scared. I don't think it's propaganda or all media spin to say that, and also just telling them their fears are wrong and you shouldn't feel that way is it's not a winning political message. It's going to be demonstrated over and over again.
Well, plot twist, Robbie. Plot twist. I don't fundamentally disagree with you, right? I think it's an entire package. Like I've said, I think it's a mistake to pretend like democratic strongholds or progressive utopias implementing progressive policies, and then we're left with this result. The reality is, in a lot of these places that are democratic strongholds, you are seeing the exact same initiatives that Republicans would put in place, the exact same kind of policies that don't address homelessness, that don't address poverty, that don't address these different issues. But then you'll get one aspect of it, you get one progressive prosecutor, and once the whole picture doesn't change, it gets blamed on these progressive policies, rather than looking at all the other Democrats and legislators and people in place that are not working to create that same kind of vision. The reality is, if we have homelessness and we have the pandemic, right, it's not a mistake or an accident or coincidence that after a pandemic where we had a lockdown, where people couldn't pay their rent, where people lost their jobs, where businesses closed down, you see a burst of people on the street. Now, if you see these legislators in these progressive cities refuse to put money into homelessness, refuse to put money into housing, refuse to put money in all these different areas to alleviate some of these social ills, then of course you're going to be left, the prosecutor, the DA is going to be left with all the backlash and all of those consequences, and there's only so much they could do within their resources. So I say I don't disagree with you. I believe that Democrats are also not doing their part to address these actual ills, but it does become a problem when they don't get along with this progressive vision, right? They're not in concert with the DAs working to alleviate these different social concerns. And then when all these different issues continue to happen and they bloom to a head, then it's the DA's fault. The DA there's only so much the DA could do if the city isn't giving money to homeless people, isn't providing adequate housing, isn't, providing adequate income, isn't providing mental health resources. And then the prosecutor's just doing their best to say, well, I know that incarceration doesn't actually help address or alleviate these things, so I'm not going to go that route, Yeah,
I think there's a really central conversation about the role that prosecuting crimes actually has to preventing the doing of the crime in the first place, and people are not interrogating the relationship between the two. There seems to be this belief that if you just prosecute more people, prosecutors don't have control over how many people commit crimes. Like the crimes are committed, and then the second order question is, how do you go about addressing it? Are there people who are best benefited by going to prison versus going into some kind of rehabilitation program versus having their fundamental economic or housing need or whatever met? That is a conversation we should be having, but instead we're kind of all operating under this fiction that if the harsher penalties are inflicted upon people who commit crimes, fewer crimes will be committed, and that relationship in terms of deterrence effect just hasn't been demonstrated in those ways. I want to give you a chance to respond to that, Michael, if you want.
Yeah, I agree 100%. And I also think what rarely gets talked about when you're dealing with prosecutors that have a more progressive vision is the huge benefits to society from folks that do not get incarcerated. We rarely talk about the people who don't go to jail, aren't spending time sitting in jail waiting for their cases to be tried. And instead they are home taking care of their kids, working for their communities, paying taxes, being a role model for others in the community. And so, but those sorts of positive benefits that we get from not incarcerating people rarely get featured in the press. They rarely get talked about by policymakers. There's a huge societal benefit to be gained by not incarcerating people. And one of, I think, the sort of real tragedies of having Chesa Boudin removed from office is there will be more people in San Francisco that go to jail, and all of the sort of social costs that come with that, and across the country, to the extent there are prosecutors that take this message to be more carceral, we will go right back into the problem that we were trying to alleviate in the first place, which is this knee-jerk reaction to incarcerate and a huge societal cost that goes with it.
And it's ironic since Chesa's own impetus to get into this field was his own family's incarceration story growing up with his father in jail. But before we go, Michael, you started your own civil rights firm yesterday. Can you tell us a little bit about it on our way out?
Sure, thank you. Yeah, I started a law firm with my partner, Ben White. We are hoping to focus on civil rights, criminal defense, and commercial civil litigation, and hopefully address a lot of these problems that we're talking about. I spent 7 years as a public defender. I spent 3 years leading a lawsuit against the white supremacists that organized the Charlottesville rally in 2017. And I'm hoping to use that background along with my partner to take on some of these issues.
Congratulations. Congratulations, Michael. That's beautiful.
Yes, congratulations. And thank you to you both for joining us today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.
Well, coming up next, we'll discuss the fallout at the Washington Post following Dave Weigel's suspension. Its story is still going on. Stay with us for that.